Giza helps us in this regard, that whoever devised Giza did so on 2 or 3 levels of intelligence. They patterned Giza such that we wouldn't understand it at face value. It would look like a curio. But inside it are messages that, once you understand ECDO theory, suddenly make complete sense, especially as regards the Khufu Pyramid or the Great Pyramid. This is what I call the tripartite observatory. Curiously, and this is after the fact, when you measure the angular distance between the shafts that come out of the Queen's Chamber and the King's Chamber, they're both at 104 degrees. But even more than that, the King's Chamber shaft, north shaft, points directly at our current Polaris North Pole, celestial North Pole. And the south shaft points dead on NP prime. And they're purposely bent off. If it was symmetrical and just happened to be 104 degrees, like the Queen's Chamber shafts, you could say it's an artifact, it's an accident. It's wonderful and curious, but I can't prove anything with it. But when you see the offset between the shafts coming out of the King's and Queen's Chamber, suddenly that's called an authentication. That's deliberate. It's not an accident. Commensurate with that, we have 104-degree separation between the 2 shafts coming out of the Queen's Chamber as well, separated by 104 degrees, as we mentioned. But those shafts had copper cables running through the shafts. Why would they run copper cables through those shafts? And by the way, terminate them before you get to the surface of the pyramid. Yet the King's Chamber shafts ran all the way to the pyramid so they could, quote, look at the sky. It's a curious differentiation between the 2 chambers. It doesn't make sense that there would be that difference in burial of 2 different individuals. And what was the role of these copper cables? So let's table that. We'll look at that in just a second. There's a 3rd chamber here. And it's an interesting chamber, the subterranean chamber. Okay, so they built a chamber that they wanted to have in secret to ceremonially bury Khufu in the King's Chamber, but in reality put his sarcophagus in the subterranean chamber where nobody would find it. That's the part of the myth around this. What I propose here with ECDO theory is that this is not a burial chamber at all. And I put Arnold Schwarzenegger's picture up from Kindergarten Cop. He's like, it's not a tomb. I went to the kid who said he had brain cancer. And I put, it's not a tomba, T-O-M-B-A. This is not a tomb. That is a zombie theory. It is dead as a doornail. It walks around thinking that it's alive and that it's scientific when it is not. So I've called this the tripartite observatory, which just means there are 3 instrument sets that function inside this observatory. And the question is, what is it observing? What is it going to observe? There we go. So as we look at a document called the Atrahasis, one of the oldest renditions of the flood myth, there's a significant preamble to the flood, the description of the flood that describes the activities of the gods. And the gods were were some principal characters: Enlil, who's the chief god, then his half-brother Enki, who was a very powerful god but was not in full charge of, and then there was what was called the 50 Lamhu heroes, who fought a celestial battle along with Enki and Enlil, and unfortunately they lost, and they were sort of sequestered on Earth for whatever reason, however you want to call that, cast down, condemned, embargoed to Earth. For whatever reason, they were stuck here, and they were stuck with the difficult life that is entailed on living on Earth. So in it, basically, Enlil's making a speech about the flood, Noah's flood, here to the 50 the council of the gods. They're called the Anunnaki as well in the Sumerian script. Zechariah Sitchin, famous books, he made the term Anunnaki famous, actually. And Enlil says, as you know, 3 teams have been assigned to monitor the balance of the Earth's rotation. We, the Anunnaki, had unanimously agreed to this procedure to ensure the longevity of our habitation and way of life. An and Adad were tasked with the monitoring of the heavens, the celestial pole. This equates to the King's chamber functionality and the 104-degree spread between the shafts, looking at NP prime and NP. My team was responsible for observing the rumblings beneath the earth, what we know now as S waves and P waves. These are the noises that emanate off the core mantle boundary and the inner and outer core at times, the signal, the chaos that's occurring there. We listen in that frequency band, the S and P waves. And then finally, Inky's team, Enlil's half-brother here he's referring to, was assigned to deploy the cables of our protection and energize them with the beneficial energy and carefully monitor Earth's balance, the geomagnetic equilibrium. So to me, and this is inductive, it's speculation, it is not science. This matches well the tripartite observatory that I conjecture is comprised by the Khufu pyramid, those 3 observatories that exist in there. So somebody was using this pyramid to detect when the state 1 to state 2 rotation was going to occur. They were listening to the core, they were watching NP prime and NP, and they were monitoring the geomagnetic field strength of the Earth. So a compelling argument can be made that this instrument indeed existed and functioned. If we look at the Queen's chamber, this would have been where Inky was supposedly doing his work. He would have been using these cables, these copper cables, and there was a pair of copper cables in the south shaft and one pair in the north shaft as well. They're evenly split, they're balanced so that the same angle exists on both sides. The 104-degree spread is there. Limestone in this frequency range is completely transparent to ionospheric and geomagnetic energy. Limestone was perfect for this. It's like glass in those frequency ranges. It looks opaque to us, but to a geomagnetic entity, you'd be able to see right through it. So if we look at this chamber, what came to mind was the possibility that if this was a geomagnetic monitoring station, that indeed the Queen's chamber itself housed a control system. Now, when we look at the cables, the cable argument, a lot of people say, no, there were no cables in these shafts. There were cables in the shafts. And there are 2 reasons why we know this. Number 1, the cable was hanging down from the door prior to the jetty project. I think it was the Upanutu project that photographed the cable hanging from the door. Then when Zahi Hawass commissioned the jetty project 3 years later, his mission was to go in and grab that cable and remove it. He didn't want that seen. So that's what they did when they drilled this hole to look behind the door, and certainly that's a wonderful scientific endeavor right there in its own right. He had the team grab the cable and pull it off the door. But a conceptual sketch here is on the right as to what it actually looked like. Under corrosion rules, and I looked this up in my corrosion textbook that I kept at the material science firm, these copper cables would have dissolved in about 3,000 or 4,000 years, and almost in their entirety, even given the arid conditions and specific conditions of Giza. In a wetter climate, they would dissolve faster, but it would be about 4,000 years. These cables would no longer exist in the shafts, except for some remnants. And indeed, that's what we saw with the Upanutu project. We saw the cable as it was in situ on the left, and then with the jetty project, Zahi Hawass grabbed the cable so that it would be removed. However, an additional factor comes to light, and that Zahi Hawass was accused in Egyptian courts of stealing artifacts from the Khufu pyramid. And in the inventory list of what he stole, or misappropriated, stole is a big word, he was acting in the capacity of the Minister of Antiquities for Egypt, so he misappropriated. And in that inventory list was a set of copper cables that he removed from the Khufu pyramid. Those cases were wiped clean. I don't know whether he was guilty or not. I can't say that. All we know is he was charged, and then the cases were ushered out of existence. So we believe those cables existed here. It may well match, and this is speculation, the tomography results, the syringes from Thomas, and for some reason I can't remember his last name, the French scientist who's done the under the ground surveys on these syringes. This exists as a power plant much in the case of what Chris Dunn has outlined. Chris Dunn, right? Yeah, Chris Dunn had outlined, except that this power plant, the power was used right there. It wasn't powering homes in Cairo. If you want to create power, and I've designed power plants and done the energy strategy for like Sierra Leone and Guinea, you don't make one big giant complex and then run the wires to everybody's homes. That would be rather dumb. If they made power here in this pyramid, it was used in that pyramid, and we'll look at the evidence why in just a second here. So our core of our argument begins at this Queen's Chamber and is centered around a principle of how limestone decays under heat. Limestone has two decay points as part of its material physics under heat, especially limestone like the backing stones on the pyramid that have seashells in it. Remember the concretion argument that we use for the backing stones. What makes them more durable and hard is it's concrete, it's concrete, yes, whereas the Tura limestone was cement. When those little critters and particles in the concreted limestone heat up above 900 degrees Celsius, a vitrification factor comes on that I call here leoparding, because it begins to pattern like leopard spots on the limestone. Once you increase the temperature and you get above 1300 degrees Celsius, you have an effect that happens called quicklime. And that's where the lime actually, it doesn't burn, it actually disintegrates. It goes back to its basic calcite state and forms a powder, and then that powder just literally crumbles off the limestone surface. As you can see here in the Queen's Chamber, and I got the chance to go in here with the guide that my client gave me. This is the East Niche Passage. It's this little shaft that runs out of the Queen's Chamber here toward the east. This is looking inward at it, and this is the niche itself. It's actually a chimney of sorts. And this is with your head in the chimney looking straight up at the ceiling. As you can see, the leoparding occurs on the base of these shelf areas, reverse shelf areas. The leoparding is strong, and the leoparding runs up to the ceiling and across the ceiling, and then does a nonlinear dissipation across the ceiling. In other words, it was heat. 100% it was heat. It was 900 degree heat across the ceiling of the Queen's Chamber, 1300 degrees Celsius heat on the immediate exit out of the East Niche Passage, producing this quicklime effect right here. Now here's the principle. There are no combustion products in the Queen's Chamber anywhere. So it can't be heat from flame. I mean, you could argue maybe it's nuclear heat. Where do we produce 1300 degrees Celsius? Can we get that directly from a nuclear reaction? A Rickover Navy man would know. But then you would have the signatures of the alteration of the isotopes in the limestone. We don't have that. The only thing this can be is electrical energy. Electrical energy is the only possibility to deliver this heat, this much heat. And the electricity was, with that much heat, it means the resistance was high, and under the equation V equals IR, that means the resistance was high, the voltage was low, and the current was extraordinary. But if the current was extraordinary, that's a circumstance where you use the energy right there on its demand. That means whatever this incredible source of energy came from, and we don't know where it came from, maybe by some device in the shaft, it was used right there in the chamber based on the V equals IR principle there. In other words, we produced so much heat that we didn't really care. We were going to use that energy anyway. My argument is that possibly this heat was used to power a shunt coil, which is the principle in radio communications that allows you to tune and optimize antenna for the frequency band that you're examining to get to receive the right signal or broadcast the right frequency. So this shunt coil right here is what I'm arguing was part of the solution here. And all this by the quicklime and leoparding decay. So that helped underpin my conjecture here that the Queen's Chamber was the monitoring of the Earth's geomagnetic field, the transparent limestone, the enormous amount of electrical energy Some people have suggested maybe it was so much energy they were trying to shepherd the mantle and preclude the Earth's rotation. I don't know if we had that much energy in there. If we go to the subterranean chamber, we look at this pyramid as a focal cone, like a sound cone they used to use at NFL football games. You know, you could hear the coach all the way across the field. You nonchalantly have the cone pointing at the coach and hear the play they're calling, what they used to do in the 70s. The pyramid flipped upside down, and knowing that limestone is fairly transparent to these P waves and S waves, acts as a focal cone. And the receiving point of this focal cone, just like a satellite dish, is right here at the centroid of the focal axis of the entire cone. In other words, the subterranean chamber is not there by accident. So if you take the average wavelength of a P wave and S wave, and you give it a reasonable banding of what the range of P and S waves are, it's that blue band right there. In other words, it's dead center on the size of the pyramid. In other words, the pyramid was built this large because it was listening to S and P waves. And if you take the wavelength and do multiples of the wavelengths, that's the 1 lambda and 2 lambda, those would be the reflection points and harmonics inside this focal cone structure, they deliver a clean, clear signal back down to exactly the subterranean chamber. Compound with that, the subterranean chamber, they find traces of mercury. Why would we put mercury in the subterranean chamber? There's no possible use, ceremonial or symbolic use of mercury inside the subterranean chamber. But there is one piezoelectric use of mercury in the subterranean chamber, in that it will receive P wave and S wave signals and turn them into electric current for monitoring in a system. So we take that solution there and we see, well, you know, the subterranean chamber is just slightly off-center. Why would they? There's a reason that we'll see this, why they put the king's chamber off-center. So these placement of these chambers are very deliberate at first, but the subterranean chamber is a little off-center. Well, if you take a look at the inner core here on the upper right, what they were doing here, I conjecture, is a thing called beam forming. In other words, by moving the focal cone centroid off to the right, they actually listened off axis. They were able to listen to the outer and inner core boundary, but yet still have a stable pyramid that was symmetrical to the Earth's gravity. They couldn't tilt the pyramid. That wouldn't work. The pyramid would crush itself under the FL and FF engineering stipulations that we talked about earlier. But by shifting the beam forming, the centroid that they used, they were able to listen off axis and hear, like a stethoscope, the heartbeat that exists right at the Earth's core mantle, or inner core and outer core boundary. I thought that was an extraordinarily smart approach, if indeed this is what they've done. Now, we talked about authentication. And this was a wonderful artifact that the designers of the pyramid used here. If we look at it, the Earth's geographic center bisects the 104-degree angle. We mentioned that earlier. Nice little curio right there, right on the 31st meridian. And the Khufu pyramid is 8 degrees of latitude south of that geographic center of the Earth in Giza. And I'm like, what an irritating thing to have happen. Just stick the pyramid at the center and run the shafts pointing each way. But here's what they did. By splitting the two and differentiating them between the king and the queen's chamber, you can see that the king's chamber represents the Giza pyramid, and the shaft angles are adjusted for NP prime and NP from the perspective of Giza. Conversely, when we look at the queen's chamber, the shafts are aligned to NP prime and NP from the perspective of the geographic center of the Earth. In other words, this is an authentication technique. They're showing the differentiation between the latitude of Giza and the latitude of the Earth's geographic center. Then finally, before we leave this section, this is an observation I made years ago, and I call it the penultimate stone. In the Queen's Chamber South Shaft, these shafts run out from the Queen's Chamber and King's Chamber. The south shaft has a stone at the very end. It was right before, where we had that copper cable hanging. And on that stone shaft, it's on the ceiling of the shaft, there is a star field chiseled into that stone. And the star field is of the north sky. Woo! All right. So let's take a look at that north star field. And let's go into the conjecture that they use this stone functionally to line the shaft to celestial north. So as you depict that, you can see here, under that conjecture, that the constellations around the North Pole, Ursa Minor, Ursa Major, Draco wraps its tail around the North Pole, Boats, Cephas, can't read them, but I remember the name of it, but anyway, all the constellations. If you take the bottom center as the reference point, or the true north point on this stone, that position on the precession of the equinoxes equates to 9,200 BCE. So the conjecture I made was that this stone was used much like a stadimeter in the Navy, that you put a mirror on the stone and you have the North Pole to your back, and the stone has the chiseling of the stars in the north sky at a particular time, and you put a mirror there and you get the two to match up. You get Cephas to match up, you get Cassiopeia to match up, that was the one I was forgetting. You get the Big Dipper to match up, the Little Dipper to match up, and you know when you get them all to match that your shaft is pointed directly true north. In other words, that's how they aligned these pyramids so exactly to true north, was they used this stadimeter principle that navigators use in the Navy. And that's why they had to have this stone at the very top of the shaft at all times. They kept moving it up. And it depicts the north sky so that the foreman can every night align the shaft to true north. But here's the problem. This shaft points southward. They have a true north sky pointing directly southward, which would have been the condition of the sky under state 2, under ECDO theory. That one struck me hard. But a secondary aspect of this observation is 9,200 BCE as the date that this pyramid was constructed. To me, that fits better the ontology of this pyramid, if I'm using the term correctly. The origin of this pyramid would come right after the Ogygian flood deluge that was described by Solon. The Ogygian flood was not the flood of Noah, it was the one 12,000 years ago. Ben has cited the cycle of 12 and 6, maybe a major and minor harmonic, Ben. That would have been the major harmonic. And so the pyramid would have been built immediately after that as either a detection mechanism or a message or both. And we still ended up with the flood of Noah regardless. So hopefully that's not good news. So it points to the south. It shows the north pointing to the south in 9,200 BCE. So that's a point that I use in the schedule that I put together. So diligence and reckoning. This will be a very short section because it's all outlined in the book. It's somewhat tedious, less presentation oriented. Just suffice to say,
if science won't conduct the experiment, society will force the experiment. One can only embargo an idea for so long.
One can only embargo an idea for so long. This doesn't require me to push ECDO theory. It's moving far faster than I can push it. It doesn't need me to push it. It just required a little bit of a defense at the very beginning, but now people are moving faster than I am at like Charles's work over here. I'm like, holy cow. But if science won't conduct the experiment, use the broader definition of the word experiment in this context, then society will force the experiment. We want to know, even if science doesn't, even if science is defending the syndicate, we as a population, we own this. This is our property. This is our intellectual property. This is our legacy, our history. And if science is serving a cabal that is terrified of this subject, then science needs to be demoted. And the public will take over this discourse and this argument. Sure, there'll be a lot of missteps and error in that, but that's the breaks of the game. It's much better than obfuscation and oppression. So if we look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, I hope you don't mind if I read it a little bit. This is Utnapishtim describing to Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh has made a 14-day journey to the east, to the land of Dilmun, which is the land of the rising of the sun. And he finally found, with the help of a barmaid that he met along a river delta, which I argue is the Indus River, mouth of the Indus River, she finally told him where Utnapishtim lived, and he wanted to find out how Utnapishtim obtained eternal life. So he finally found Utnapishtim, and after they got some rest, after portaging the river, up the river, Utnapishtim says to him, I will reveal to you, Gilgamesh, a thing that is hidden, a secret of the gods, I will tell you. Ea, or Enki, the clever son of Anu, was bound by an oath with the Anunnaki, so he repeated their knowledge of the coming deluge to my reed house and said, reed house, wall, wall, were you to speak with him, say to the man of Sharapuk, the son of Ubartutu, tear down your house and build a boat, because a flood was coming. So that stated day had arrived. In the morning, Shamash let loaves of flaming bread, tephra volcanic bombs, some editions say flaming, tephra volcanic bombs shower down. In the evening, a rain of wheat, tephra, ash, or lapilli. These are both volcanic effects that arrived on the same day as Utnapishtim observed. I watched the appearance of the weather. The weather was frightful to behold. I went into the boat and sealed the entry. Just as dawn began to glow, there arose from the horizon a black cloud. And so if he saw it in the morning with the rising of the sun, odds are the clouds were in the west. Just to the west of this region, of course, is the African caldera. There are 25, 26 volcanoes right there that we monitor as part of ECDO theory. That's where he saw this pyroclastic cloud floating in the sky. It was a sight to behold. Saw it in the dawn horizon. Thunder rumbled inside of it. Before him went a dark squall and lightning with a large pyroclastic maelstrom going out over the mountain and land. The Anunnaki lifted up their torches, setting the land ablaze with their flare. The stunning shock of the maelstrom overtook the heavens and turned to blackness all that had been light. Then all the land suddenly shattered like a clay pot. We talk about those striations, tectonic striations, which all have the focal point right on the Euler axis points on the earth. Shattered like a clay pot, the land, in one day. All day long the south wind blew, blowing fast, inundating the mountain in water. That was the mountain of Susa. It's not really a mountain, it's more like a sand dune, but they called it a mountain. Overwhelming the people like an attacking army. No one could see his fellow. They all perished. The ocean sietched. When you get in your bathtub, the bathtub water will shift back and forth for a while. That's called sietching. That's what the oceans did for 7 days after this 2-day event where the earth shattered like a clay pot. And that was the description that Utnapishtim gave to Gilgamesh. Whether it's faithfully rendered, we don't know for sure. So I put together a timeline that this represents, and that's up at the top of this chart. And you can see here the orange section is the days of kinetic terror, the earth shattering like a pot, the tephra bombs, the lapilli, the land set ablaze. The land shatters is almost the last event in all of this. So we have significant volcanic activity, and then all of a sudden we have the tectonic shattering point, which introduces then 7 days and 7 nights of tumultuous oceanic activity, until finally people can emerge from whatever habitation they're in. If we look at the 175 global flood myths, the plurality of them, not the majority, the plurality of them match this 9-day period. They tell the same story that Utnapishtim tells. The Bible doesn't match. It focuses on the rain, which I think is maybe a mechanism to make it a little more simple and palatable to a broader audience. Because how do you sell this story to an ancient? And I don't really know how you do that. But I think that the preponderance of myth, they agree with both the Atrahasis epic and the epic of Gilgamesh, and according to this timeline. Oh, there we go. So if we look at the timeline, and this is a question that many people ask, we talked about it a lot here today. This is a lot of detail. Some of it is conjecture. It's the best guess that I have currently in each case. This is subject to modification. So this version was on March 5th, I believe it was, of this year. But basically it cites two intervals, so you don't have to look at all the detail on it. It cites that, yes, there's a major and minor expression of this state 1 to state 2 rotation. If you look in Herodotus, what the priests of Ptah communicated to Herodotus was that the sun has moved 4 times during the inception of the tracking that the priests were custodians over the records. It said twice it had moved from its setting to the point of its rising, and twice it had moved from its rising to the point of its setting, which means 2 ECDO events, 4 solar movements. That's the same thing. And they said that had been in the last 11,700 years. It matches well the Solon's reputed dating of the flood, the deluge of Ogygian, and the deluge of Deucalion in his tradition. So it shows as items 1, 2, and 3, 4 in the green and purple there in the bottom panel. If we relate that to the precession of the equinoxes, which some theorize is the cycle of cataclysm for the Earth, it suggests a 6,443-year cycling of this deluge, maybe a strong one, and 6,443 years later, maybe a milder one. But if we killed 19 of every 20 people, that's still pretty darn strong, even on that one, on that second one. But as you look back, there's an interesting effect that we saw at Göbekli Tepe, in particular Pillar 43. When I worked to decode Pillar 43, I disagreed with Sweatman. What was it? Marvin Sweatman, I think is his name. Did some work on decoding Pillar 43, which is called the Vulture Stone at Göbekli Tepe. It suggests that an event occurred here commensurate with the Hyena-Pali geomagnetic excursion, 14,800 BCE. So if we take that 14,800 BCE point, the Solon advertised deluge of Ogygian at 9,600 BCE, and then the Noah Deucalion flood, or epic, at 4,400 BCE, we end up with an interval of 5,200 years. Thought that was curious, but we've already surpassed that interval. I guess that's good news. So the bottom line is all we have left in the proposed cycling is a 6,443-year interval, which ends in 2030, right there. But I put the note there, that is not a prognostication, it's not a forecast. It's only a mathematical calculation. Don't panic over it. Now, it does agree with Ben, somewhat Ben. So I give it credence more because it agrees with Ben than my calculation, so just take that with a grain of salt. The final things we see here, the 19 out of 20 people being culled around 5,000 BC to 4,400 BC, we can't ignore that. Under a hypothesis duty to address and inform, a hypothesis must explain that. It can't ignore it. The Fourth Dynasty hypothesis is nowhere near touching that subject. It only explains part of the story. So those are the major highlights in here, other than geomagnetic excursions, some extreme temperature increases, trying to match those with the ECDO theory here. They don't all match up, and some of this is bound to be wrong, but we'll keep improving it into the future as information gets better. But that's our timeline, and it's where I'm somewhat sympathetic to the 2030 claims. I see where this originates in some part. And if we look at it here, if we're tipping into a geomagnetic excursion, which I call here the Gauss geomagnetic excursion in honor of Henry Gauss. We used to degauss our ships down at this range near Puerto Rico. That was always fun. You get to go into Puerto Rico and drink for 2 or 3 nights while the ship got zapped with electromagnetic energy. But that would be the major highlights of this chart. It's in full color at the website, so you can see it better than here. And of course, in the book, it's black and white, so the publisher's like, I couldn't barely see it. Diligence and reckoning, I don't want to go through all of these. The predictions, there are a couple pages worth of predictions. The significant one is the prediction that ancient monuments should somehow act under the desperate motivation to communicate this NP prime principle, or SP prime. Some point to SP prime, same thing. And indeed, it's 24 here, but it's actually number 34. on the website. But indeed, that's what we observed. And then the 35th one we'll talk about. There's actually another one with an observation on the AMOC current, but 35 predictions, so far 34 satisfied. We're well on the way to the 35th one. I asked ChatGPT to digest all the objections into these categories. And so we looked through emails, we looked through ex posts, boiled it down into 7 basic objections. There's more detail in the book on this. This is just a summary of it to digest here. The first one, and it's put in ChatGPT's lingo here, which I didn't understand it fully when I first saw it. Dependence on an unresolved core mental boundary condition, which is a fancy word just saying your sloughing principle is yet to be proven. I'm like, well, yeah, that's the way hypothesis works. I didn't finish the job by myself, you know. So that is not applicable because it's relevant, but it's not salient, and there's a difference there. The way you keep a scientific team focused and effective in an organization that delivers science is you keep them focused on salient activities, not mere relevance. So it's relevance. We're not there yet. So yeah, you can raise the objection, but what are you doing? You're not helping anybody. Just making yourself look smart. It's a given. That's where we are. Physical, methodological, and constraint, it's a heteroductive synthesis. It simply means we're making observations that run counter to the narrative, hence the word hetero. It's ductive, in other words, we're conducting inference with this, and I argued back, and ChatGPT agreed, we're using abduction and deduction and induction, but it still said under the method of science it's heteroductive, which means we're running counter to the narrative. That's where we are. So yes, it's an objection. In other words, scientists don't agree with you. When people online say, scientists don't agree with you, we're like, well, how can they agree or disagree? They haven't even heard it yet. So that's another feckless statement. It really means nothing. It sounds good, but it means nothing. Observational constraint, lack of direct diagnostic measures, absolutely. But we have the Deep Argo program underway now, so that will be solved. That's a critical path, salient issue. So number 3, absolutely valid, totally salient. Number 4, epistemic constraint, identification of true polar wander in deep time. That's a fancy way of saying, can we see it in the past in Earth's geologic record? I contend that we can, through the work that Craig Stone has done. But it's absolutely salient. I think it's solved. Methodological constraint, absence of peer review. Oh, yawn. It's like going to a 5-year-old who's at, their Little League game. Well, I don't see you with a World Series win. It's like, come on. How arrogant can you get? We're not near peer review. It's relevant, but it's not salient. It's almost insultingly puerile. It's childlike in its contention. Then the objection was made that the fluid nature of the mantle, we already addressed this morning, not yesterday, that the mantle, yes, it's a viscoelastic fluid, but just like when you jump off a bridge, water doesn't save you if you hit it at 180 miles per hour, whatever our terminal velocity is of a human body. It's still a brick wall. Same thing here is when the planet rotates inside 7 days, it's a solid. It's not a liquid in the least. So that is, again, it's a feckless, not even relevant statement in this case, but it's an objection that doesn't have applicability. And then finally, the Janabekov effect doesn't apply to Earth. It can't cause this. Absolutely true, but we never said that it did. The oversimplification, straw man said that we said that, but we're only saying that the Janabekov pathway is the pathway of least resistance, and we do have to cite that because it's an important principle. It's why the rotation is disciplined to the 31st meridian. So it is important, but it didn't cause the rotation. So only 2 of these end up being salient concerns, and really that defines our next steps as a theory, as a scientific endeavor. We have to resolve items 3 and 4 on this chart, and we lay that methodology out a little bit, allude to it in the book a little bit.
Well, Roger, I must admit that you have assembled a noteworthy and compelling first argument here. It has a long way to go yet, but that is understandable, since you have just introduced it, so I will bag any complaints about lack of peer review or needs ongoing study on the part of real scientists, and some such crap. Those are simply deflections at this point in the scientific process. What you have done here is, as you have claimed, to have introduced the hypothesis set into the scientific discourse. As the theory sponsor, that is your job right now. Whether or not the theory proves out remains to be seen. I am going to have to place my confidence in your overarching theory at around 40% for now. But do not be dismayed. 40%, given the state of development we are in here, is damn fine confidence, ranking among an equivalent viability of some of our most revered scientific thinking. A long way to go yet, but I have to admit this is one hell of a start. Congratulations.
So ECDO theory, in closing, ECDO theory does not ask for belief, the illegitimate roommate that we talked about this morning. It petitions for a disciplined examination of novel and necessary ideas. It portends a shift into a new knowledge. Thank you for listening to presentation number 2. I mentioned like 4 or 5 times yesterday the elements of hypothesis, and I wanted to at least run through those today. Oh, a touchpad is tough with a scroll bar. Let's see if I can scroll that way. Oh, good, good. So we're going to go through this article here that is called A Curious Astrological Confluence. It's primarily about a monument built in Turkey called Nimrut Dağ. But we'll go through what that entails here in a second. But I wanted to look at the 7 elements of hypothesis. These elements of hypothesis are assembled from works of 3 or 4 different philosophers. They're not something I made up out of a vacuum. And principally Karl Popper, the statement of what constitutes a hypothesis by Wikipedia at the time, and then 2 or 3 other prominent philosophers and scientists. So, in fact, here we go. One of whom, I describe the sourcing here, one of whom is Theodore Schick and Louis Vaughan, Karl Popper. So this is not something I made up, although I will say that I critiqued the work of these philosophers because I felt like it was incomplete. After managing the Material Science Research Corporation, you know, you have just about every curveball thrown at you that you can possibly get. Most of it from the board of directors because they're usually pretty insistent and persnickety since it's their money in theory. But here we go. Now we got it. Yeah, I can do it from the list here. So the first element of hypothesis, just to satisfy curiosity on this, is the construct that you present. Construct, remember, is an idea that is not yet a hypothesis. The construct that you present must have necessity behind it. In other words, I can't propose that Mars is populated by, you know, a 10 billion army of 12-foot hairy people just out of the vacuum and call that a scientific hypothesis. There's just no necessity for that. Now, some people may say, well, there is necessity. If you're able to find the observations which pique that as a construct that surface it as necessary, then yes, that would be the first element of hypothesis. But just any idea that we can come up with is not necessarily a construct based upon necessity. So that necessity is that first hint that Occam's razor demands, as we reviewed yesterday. Plurality should not be posited without necessity. That's the essence of this first statement here. The second is Wittgenstein, definition and defined domain. That's Ludwig Wittgenstein and his philosophy, Tractus Cell Philosophy or something, I forget the name of the 2 documents. They were very prescient, very insightful modifications to standing philosophy inside science in the early 1900s. And I call the violations of this Wittgenstein error and the tests of neologism, creating new ideas out of a vacuum. When you define something, you've got to be very precise in your terminology and the domain which you're addressing, so the subject domain which you're addressing. So that's your first duty inside the development of a hypothesis. So when someone says, causes a pole flip, that's a violation of Wittgensteinian constraint. In other words, that's not a hypothesis, even though we're talking about pole flips, but the simple phrase pole flips is not constrained under a Wittgenstein definition and domain. So that's part of the onus of a hypothesis, the requirement of a hypothesis. Parsimony versus prior art. We cited prior art yesterday. You've got to look and see what is the body of work that has been done by scientists researching this in the past and amateur researchers, lay researchers in the past. And parsimony means if my convention adheres to their work, I need to conservatively extrapolate or increment from that prior art. You don't want to get too outlandish in your work. Probably one of the weaknesses of ECDO theory is it extrapolates from prior art pretty far, further than a typical hypothesis. But ECDO theory is not a typical hypothesis. Its potential comes from it having been obfuscated in the past. So it's a little bit of an anomaly versus the normal scientific hypothesis. Its reach, explanatory reach coming out of the box is an exception because the playing field has been tampered with to begin with. So that's why, the ECDO theory tends to have a little bit of a broad reach in terms of this third requirement. I mentioned it probably 5 times yesterday, duty to reduce, address, and inform. If we find marbling in the foundation stones, the limestones underneath the pyramid, and conjecture that marbling has come from earthquakes, that's inductive evidence. When you develop a hypothesis, you don't necessarily have to serve that observation because it's inductive, it's suggestive. It does not place a burden on every alternative out there. However, when we look at the erosion band that exists on the Khafren pyramid, that's deductive evidence. It's undeniable, it's exceptional, and it must be addressed by any hypothesis, including the Khufu Fourth Dynasty hypothesis, that says that because of the Leo Stela, because of a couple depictions of Egyptians hauling stone on wet sand or rolling timbers, therefore Khufu built the pyramid, and there's nowhere where Khufu says himself that he built the pyramid. If you venerate that as a hypothesis, you have to address the erosion band on Khafren because it's deductive. So the deductive evidence is part of that burden of the duty to address and inform. So if you don't do that, you don't actually have a hypothesis. So when I talk with people about the Fourth Dynasty narrative of the Old Kingdom in 2540 BCE, Khufu built the pyramid in 20 years, which did not happen. As a construction engineer, I know he didn't build the pyramid in 20 years, and he did not build it via a ramp. Ramps are horrible ways to build pyramids, and there are a number of reasons why. But the pyramid, that hypothesis is what I call a zombie theory. It's dead, but it's walking around pretending that it's alive. It's a pseudo-hypothesis, that's conveniently in the article here. And then a hypothesis is based on intelligence, not just data. And this alludes to p-hacking. If I go out and find a correlation between athlete's foot and heart disease, my temptation is to run around in front of that and develop a mechanism to explain it, and then put that out on the market, put a lot of jargon in it that peer review reviewers will accept, and get that study published, because what I did was I was p-hacking. I saw an anomaly in the statistics, developed an explanation for it, and published a study. Now, the study's inductive. I'm not claiming it's final proof, but I build my credential on spotting an anomaly in the statistics. That's basing the hypothesis on data rather than intelligence. And as an intelligence professional, there are probably 3 levels. You have data is transmuted, data is denatured into information, and information is transmutated into intelligence. Intelligence is the first time that you've brought the consilience or the concomitants, these are the philosopher's terms, to bear in order to derive true knowledge. So your hypothesis has got to be based on intelligence, not just data. P-hacking is symptomatic of just basing an idea on the data alone, and that's a mistake that we made all through COVID. We enforced policies that were detrimental to the public, basing it on data alone. They were not true analytical hypotheses. We have to describe the mechanism. When we talk about ECDO theory, we're fairly precise on mechanism. When we define the 5 elements that couple the mantle and the core, that was necessary first, but it probably was in more detail than we could really justify just yet. However, the mechanism, our mechanisms were the sloughing or the melting off of the core material, number one, and secondly, the degradation of the geomagnetic field. Those 2 elements as a mechanism explain the dissolution of all those factors that couple the core and the mantle. So there we describe the mechanism. Is that mechanism 100% right? The odds are likely not, that there has to be some modification therein. But that may happen 100 years from now. The mechanism is still valid, is still useful for the construction of this hypothesis. So ECDO satisfies this point number 6. And then finally, of course, exposure to accountability. Incremental risk versus past prior art. That means that if we take prior art, we take our conjecture and bolt it onto that prior art, we're going to have to make predictions as to what that pathway entails. And indeed, ECDO theory, we make 35 predictions, and they come true. It is not normal for a hypothesis to make 35 predictions 2 years out the gate and have 34 of them confirmed. That's not normal. Again, we got a little bit of an exception here because of the efforts, extensive efforts that were undertaken to obfuscate this principle. So those are the 7 elements of hypothesis. Since I mentioned them so much yesterday, I thought I'd run through those with you. But now what we want to look at, the scrolling is slow, is a different message, a different hypothesis. And I really looked at this last night. I ran through it quickly. It's called a curious ancient astrological confluence. And like I was saying, I wore my white shirt today to play good cop in contrast with wearing my black shirt yesterday. Hopefully this is a little bit more positive a story, but it doesn't have the underpinning that ECDO theory has in comparison. However, when we look at it, it actually meets all the 7 elements of hypothesis. So it is a hypothesis. My opinion has been, and I'm going to publish this in a book in October 2027, and just in time for the holidays in 2027, but my opinion of this has been, self-assessment of it has been, it's not a true hypothesis, it's strong speculation. It's a cool idea backed up by some pretty interesting anomalous evidence gathering and intelligence, but that doesn't qualify it as a full scientific hypothesis. But actually last night as I was looking through it, it actually is a hypothesis. I just don't want to flag it that way too early. It's got to have some more maturity. But basically, what we are, let's see, I may want to get my mouse out. This is a little better than because we're going to open these pictures with a mouse click here. Get it go in there. There we go. Ta-da! Open image, a new tab. There we go. Now we can zoom in on it. We're going to talk about this nation called Comagene. I think it's Comagene. I've heard it pronounced 3 different ways, and of course, I think everybody would be at a loss on the true pronunciation. This was ruled by Antiochus I and was somewhat akin to Switzerland in terms of its relationship with the Osrhoene Empire, the Parthian Empire, and the Roman Empire at that time. The period of time that we're talking about here is from 110 BC to about 10 AD. So it's just at the end of the age of Pisces, excuse me, just at the end of the age of Aries as we transition into Pisces. Nominally, that transition, depending on the astrological basis, occurs anywhere from 1 AD to 25 AD to 100 AD, just a little bit of playroom between those two ages in the zodiac. And Commagene was ruled by an individual who called himself Basilis Magus. And that simply meant the custodian of the wisdom of the Magi. It's interesting, an interesting title here. He had a longer title that involved the word epiphany and rule, and I won't even go to it. The short title was Basilius Magus. So that does the job. The keeper of the custodian of the wisdom of the Magi. So Antiochus I had inherited a lot of the Magi wisdom that came out of the Parthian Empire, which would be Persia, under the Media-Persia construct in the Bible. The wisdom that had come from Mesopotamia, and the wisdom that had come out of Greece, which, of course, the Greek Empire predated the Roman Empire here. And curiously, the three wise men that were the Magi of repute were Zoroastrian, which would equate to the ancient form of the Persian religion, Avestan. We'll mention the term Avestan, A-V-E-S-T-A-N. That's the first religious philosophy that emerged after the state 2 back to state 1 rotation under ECDO theory in 4400 BCE. Avestan philosophy originated within 200 years of our return to state 1. So it is, Avestan philosophy is the original, I don't want to call it a religion necessarily, but it's the original philosophy that mankind worked with prior to Sumer, prior to Akkadiya, prior to the Indus Valley civilizations, prior to the Vedas, most of the Vedas. There's some portions of the Rig Veda that are supposedly date to 6000 BCE, but most of the Vedic literature, prior to certainly Islam, the Abrahamic religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. So that Avestan philosophy we're going to lean on heavily here. But Commagene also was curiously positioned at the end of the Taurus mountain range. And this star here, this observatory called Nimrut Dag, was the prize possession, the prize observatory, the prize Hierothelion, as Antiochus called it, in his kingdom. And as keeper of the wisdom of the Magi, he positioned this observatory at the last tallest mountain that looked eastward in Turkey, in Anatolia, Turkey. But one thing I want to point out here, and I've spent some time going through Turkey. I did a strategy for United Colors of Benetton, Çarşı stores, a couple other stores and consumer goods manufacturers in Turkey and Istanbul, and then traveled through what is called Anatolia. Istanbul is on the European continental side, and when you cross the Bosphorus, you end up in Anatolia. The word Anatolia in Greek means the east. So if you think back to the traditional, the biblical tradition, the wise men said, "Behold, we have seen his star in the east." Most theologians interpret that as we saw his star in the eastern sky. But what they're saying in that phrase in the Greek is, "Behold, we observed his star while we were in Anatolia," because Anatolia means the east. Commagene Nimrut Dag, this mountain that is at the end of the Taurus mountain chain and looking eastward so that it can see a very broad horizon of stars and the horizon, is one of the key spots in Anatolia, the east. So we bear that in mind first before we assail this subject. As we look at the region, this is the the Google Earth map for the region, and I call it the Four Rivers region. And there's a reason for that, other than it just trivially being four rivers, because the tradition that is outlined in the Bible is that there were four rivers that circumnavigated the Garden of Eden. The Gihon, the Pishon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. Well, those rivers, only two of the names are preserved today, But one of the key things was that the Gihon flowed around the land of Havilah, in which there was much gold. And of course, we have that in the Khabar River that is just to the east of this. If you look at this green square artifact in southern Turkey here, is just below Nimrat Dagh. That is called Padan Aram, or the field of the Aramaeans. And Aramaic, of course, was the second principal language behind Hebrew, spoken in especially Israel and portions of Judah and Jerusalem during the time of the transition from Aries to Pisces, the time that we're talking about here, that 110 BC to 10 AD. The second river that we consider here, the Pishon, was a river that flowed through and watered the entire garden. And then, of course, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers as well. I contend, under speculation, that these are the four rivers spoken of in the Bible. Supporting that is the Arabic, or the Islamic description of where Eden supposedly resided. And they said, it says in the scriptures that Eden resided between the headwaters